with you. We're going to move on to our next segment. It's our Bookster segment. Bookster is a website for book lovers and much more. Joining us in studio is Richard Wolff. He's the founder of Democracy at Work and author of the new book, Understanding Marxism. Welcome back, Richard.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
And joining us on Skype, we have Benny Johnson. He's a news columnist at the Daily Caller. Welcome, Benny.
Hi. What's going on?
Hey, you're internet famous. We're happy to have you.
That's so great. That's just like being real famous, except for like no money and like you're not actually famous. No one recognizes you. So thanks.
Well, we recognize you.
Wow, you spoil me.
Okay, why don't we start off, Richard? Why don't you tell us a little bit about your book?
Okay, my book is a response to what's going on in the United States, particularly since the crash of 2008. People have begun to kind of wake up after half a century and realize that the capitalist system is only one of the alternative systems we have, and that it is a reasonable thing for people to debate their economic system just as they debate their political systems, their education system, and everything else. And after 50 years when that was taboo, too dangerous, too scary for people to question capitalism, the Cold War and all of that, now that capitalism didn't do so well for a large number of people for 10 years, people are once again remembering or rediscovering a long tradition of being critical of capitalism, and Marxism is the most systematic expression of all of that. And I'm trying to help people come to terms with that, kind of catch up, if you like, to all that has happened to Marxism in the last 50 years. It's also changed like everything else, and so people are very interested, and there's a need for this to be helped along by those of us who have studied this stuff.
Richard, what do you think most people misunderstand about Marxism?
It's really less misunderstanding than just not knowing. You know, there was an active conversation about Marxism, its strengths, its weaknesses, up until the end of the Second World War. Let's remember, during the 1930s, the United States had very big socialist parties, communist parties. We were allied with the Soviet Union, a socialist country, during World War II. So there was lots of discussion and investigation, and then it all stopped. After World War II, the Cold War, the ally of the Soviet Union became the great enemy, and nobody was to discuss it, nobody was to go near it. There was a kind of fear that settled in. We sometimes call it McCarthyism. It has lots of names. And so for a long time, people didn't study it, people didn't talk about it. And it's not so much misunderstanding as a kind of void. We don't really know. The only time the issue came up was as the bad other. Russia, China, Cuba, whatever. And so people say, whoa, we got to keep away from it. That's not an incentive to learn much about it. And so now there's a kind of rediscovery, particularly among younger people who didn't go through all of that scary stuff because they weren't around then. And so they're open in a way that the older folks aren't, to asking these questions. They want to know, what is the criticism of capitalism? Let's talk about it. Not necessarily to decide one way or the other, but let's have a conversation about the pros and cons. And Marxism is the most developed set of criticisms we have, so it's a good place to start.
So, Richard, you said that there's this thing of other, or that it's in the past, of Marxism and socialism, and in my facts, it's not about fear. You have a real-life example of what's happening with socialism in Venezuela, and the misery and the tyranny under a socialist like Nicolas Maduro is really par for the course. And over time, you've had 100 million people, whether it's under the Soviet regime, whether under it's just any regime that has taken up Marxist ideology, has resulted in misery and death. I want to get Benny's take on this in terms of responding to Richard's book of what he's saying, that it's really based on fear that people don't know enough about Marxism.
Yeah, by fear, I mean, by the fear, do you mean like the fear of being thrown into a gulag? By fear, do you mean like the fear of mass executions, like the fear of having your family taken in the middle of the night by the Soviet regimes that you say we should be modeling our society after? By fear, do you mean like the fear of having your entire property, your children, and everything that you own and love taken from you immediately by a state for the common good? Is that the kind of fear that you're talking about? Because
no,
that's the kind of fear. Reason why people fear communism. Hold on just a second, because I held my tongue even when I was like enraged as you were explaining some of the most astronomically, I think, poorly founded political expression I've heard in an interview in a very long time. You say that capitalism hasn't worked.
You should get out more.
like heard capitalism hasn't worked really well for the people under capitalism. That's fine. I agree. There's no such thing as a perfect economic system. You and I can both, I think, very much agree with that. But capitalism hasn't killed 100 million people in this century, and that has nothing to do with me making up terms. I mean, that's by the National Institute the National Institute for the Study of Communism says those numbers. This is a really poisonous political theory, and I don't think we should be messing with it at all in a sophisticated modern age that we are living in right now.
That's the kind of fear-mongering that I was talking about, exactly that sort of rendition. Let's consider it a little bit, okay? Over the last century, because the gentleman spoke about that, we've had 2 world wars. Those 2 world wars were started by capitalist economic systems fighting one another. Germany, United States, Britain, Japan, and so on. They didn't have any socialism that was part of this story, and lots of people got killed. Do we say, gee, let's not have capitalism? Wait a minute. I waited for you, the minimum rules of discussion.
Yeah, let's let him finish his thought, Benny, then we'll let you jump in.
Right. That's the way this is done. Number one. Number two, let's do some comparison if we're going to talk about examples of socialism. Let's take the People's Republic of China for the last 25 years. The rate of growth of the average standard of living, the wages of the Chinese workers, have gone up roughly 5 to 6 times. The wages of the United States worker over that time gone absolutely nowhere. If you're going to compare socialist experience, why don't you deal with the countries that are just as much positive as they are negative? Nobody ever said socialism solves all problems. It has its experiences that work. It has its experiences that don't, and you hopefully learn from those that don't. It would be as if I decided that capitalism is going to be judged by what is done in Saudi Arabia, a capitalist country, or by the leader of the Philippines, another capitalist country, who takes drug suspects that haven't been tried and drops them off of airplanes and is proud of it. I could tell fear-mongering stories about what capitalism does, but it would be silly. And to pick the Venezuelans as an example because of all their difficulties, as if that's some emblem of socialism, come on, that's not serious. That's the fear-mongering we're talking about.
To respond.
Sure. So, I mean, where do you even start at cutting up this argument? First off, answer me this question. You said that capitalist countries caused the Great World War II, in which you then are probably going to extrapolate. That's why the gulags happened over the last 70 years, and that's why Stalin killed 50 million people, which is more than Hitler killed in the Holocaust. But let me ask you, what does the term Nazi stand for?
The term Nazi stands for...
The party of the Nazis.
The party of the Nazis stands for National Socialist Workers' Party.
Exactly.
Okay, great. So you said that there were only capitalists involved in that. That's absolutely incorrect. That's
if you knew anything, even the most minimum about of German history, you would know that the reason Hitler took the name socialist was because the working class in Germany had already aligned itself with socialist and communist parties. And the way to get going as a political party trying to appeal to the German working class, which is all documented in the history of the Nazi Party, was to call themselves a socialist party, put the word national in front of it. The first 4 letters of the word national in German are N-A-Z-I, national. That's why that name was chosen, as a way to appeal and pull the working class away from the left so it would become a fascistic organization by playing on the name. It's a standard game in politics, which we know real well in the United States, that is often used. All the parties that call themselves democratic are hardly in favor of democracy, but they know it's a game.
If you look at the results, it was very socialistic results, and I would actually argue with you that it was not fascism. Read the writings of F.A. Hayek, the writings of Milton Friedman. All their arguments show economically that what was happening within the National Socialist, i.e. Nazi regime, this was the government controlling the means of production, and that's what Marxism is. So nationalism, Nazi socialism is actually Marxism, and it resulted in the deaths of millions and millions of people.
The first people that the Nazis went after, I mean, the history here is a little problematic. The first place the Nazis went to work at, inside Germany politically, and then in war, was against the Soviet Union, because they hated Bolshevik.
It was against the capitalists in their own country.
If you're going to invite people to have a conversation, then there has to be a conversation. The people targeted as the great enemy of the National Socialists from the beginning were the Bolsheviks, were the socialists, and the communists. Yes. They were the ones that were attacked at home. They were the ones. Oh, it's extraordinary. Yes. I guess my point was, as I began, that for 50 years it's been impossible to have this conversation because we deal in extremes of good and evil. And as long as you have a conversation in politics in which one side is a repository of goodness and the other side is a repository of evil, then you have these dead-end conversations in which we don't listen to each other. The whole point is to recognize that the United States is almost the only country in the world, certainly the most only developed country in the West, that forbids the conversation of socialism and communism in a normal way. If you go to France or Germany and you pay...
Bernie Sanders would disagree. Bernie Sanders self-identifies as a socialist.
And he's the first one in 50 years. He's a big breakthrough, just like my book is, because he's the first one in 50 years to dare to do that, since before you were pilloried in this country because you couldn't have a conversation. And his importance is in breaking through and saying, look, let's grow up as a nation and begin to talk as reasonable people about the strengths and weaknesses of capitalism. If you weren't so defensive, I don't mean you personally, but if the country weren't so defensive about this, they would engage in this conversation. Let's see what we can learn from each other. What are the weaknesses? If you give capitalism a pass like this, it can't be discussed, the alternatives can't be looked at, it has to be all good and evil extremes, then you're going to allow the worst qualities of capitalism to go uncriticized and unchanged.
Benny, go ahead.
Richard, Richard, no one is saying that we can't have this conversation. We've had this conversation over the last 100 years. We've seen these ideologies played out. So since you're going to deny history and deny that Nazis are actually socialists, and that's one of the more absurd things that I've heard in a long time, since they nationalized healthcare, nationalized industries, they nationalized, yes, I get it, ha, ha, ha.
No, you didn't.
No,
that's the trouble.
Let me ask you something, Richard.
Well, then do ask.
Since these have been tried and been tried in full in multiple advanced countries over the last century, how many more dead would it take for you to call these ideologies a failure? Would it take 100 more million? Maybe 1 more million? Because right now you're standing on the corpses of 100 million people. Advocating
that's exactly the level of conversation as if I said to you over and over again, you're standing on the heads of all the dead people, of all the wars and all the colonial adventures that capitalism has had. You know, the world in the last 50 to 100 years has been characterized above all by the demand of third world countries, Asia, India, Latin America, it's going on today, to get out from under the kind of imperialism that capitalism was famous for 200 years. You want me to count all the people that were killed? Shall I make a big number and then beat folks over the head so they don't have the conversation by accusing them of killing? Killing is something that a lot of systems have done. Socialism shouldn't do it. It has no more excuse than the other systems. But if we're going to count dead, you have a very peculiar way of doing it.
If you include Nazis and Soviets together, you have the greatest mass murder in the history of the human existence, in the history of recorded history. And you are sitting here advocating that that's not enough data for us to say that these are bad ideologies and that these ideas cause harm to people. You're sitting here right now.
I want to respond to your point on China, though, because first of all, China has zero respect for human rights. They treat human beings as if it was another natural resource like cement. They harvest the organs of their own people. So if you're trying to hold them up as a model for your communism and your Marxism, I will not listen, as well as the fact that you're talking about—
That is the tradition. Not listening is exactly the tradition.
If you think that it's okay to wipe away human rights—
Nobody has wiped anything away.
In this way, to hold it up as a model,
it's not a model. It's not a model. It's talking about a reality. The United States today.
The other point is that the wage growth that you talked about, if you're talking from a base of living in a hut versus, having some income, that could be a 200% income growth. That is a growth in wages, but you're talking about poverty and starvation. And the only reason why the poverty and starvation is minimized is because of capitalism that has been introduced into China.
Really, it's a remarkable story in which the good news is all on one side and the bad news is all on the other. I mean, I thought we outgrow that kind of childishness at a certain point. Here's the reality of economics.
Exist in the world.
Let me do the economics. I'm an economics professor. That's what I do for a living. Over the last 25 years, one of the poorest countries on earth, China, one of the poorest countries on earth, has become the second most important economy in the world and will, within 10 years, be the #1 economy in the world in terms of output. It has a record of economic growth that is way better than anything achieved by any capitalist country, especially the United States. They're sad this year that their economic growth is 6.5%. Ours is at 2.5%.
It was 4% this quarter.
Yes, this quarter, and it's an exceptional quarter, which everyone who follows this knows. No, the average over the last 10 years has been 2.5% to 3% in good years, and you don't count the bad ones, which you should, because then the average would come down. But the reality is that the Chinese are in a different league from us. You have to face that, or you can pretend you don't.
I'm not.
The reality
I'm
is
the reason why they have that growth is because of capitalism. We got to wrap. I'm going to give Benny. I know you're not in the set, so Benny, last word.
Sure. Well, there's plenty of communist societies and socialist societies currently today that are practicing all of the wonderful utopian ideas that Sweet Richard has proposed today. And so, as a professor and an economics professor who has never had to live under these regimes, I would deeply recommend that Richard.
You're just making it up as you go.
Richard should go and move to North Korea or move to Venezuela right now because the utopia is waiting for him.
Well, you know, if you could get people like me out, then you wouldn't have to listen to different points of view, and you could go back to the sleepy times of the last 50 years when these conversations weren't possible.
We have to wrap.
Speech.
All right, we got to wrap, guys. Thanks so much for joining us both. Appreciate it.
Glad to be here.
All right.
Hey.
Thanks, Benny.